Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is the podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. For the United States and its relationship with the Middle East, the past 2 decades have been era-defining. After 9/11, the Bush administration's invasion and subsequent chaotic occupation of Iraq came to encapsulate American foreign policy in a way not seen since Vietnam. Adjacent to that conflict, images of prisoners in orange jumpsuits at the US military base at Guantanamo Bay came to stand for American hypocrisy, preaching human rights and freedom on the one hand, while condoning torture and imprisonment without trial. Now the US finds itself trying, but failing, to distance itself from the region, with a conflict in the Middle East once again dominating the headlines. Washington has found itself drawn into the war in Gaza by virtue of its support, political, diplomatic, and military, of its key regional ally, Israel. My guest this week has had an insider's perspective for many of these momentous events. Growing up between the US and Egypt, she signed up in her early 20s to work as an interpreter in Iraq in 2003. Subsequently, she spent nearly 2 years working at Guantanamo Bay before going on to work as a researcher and advisor at the Pentagon, where over the course of almost a decade, she advised 3 separate US defense secretaries on the Middle East, in times of crisis, including post-war Iraq, the Arab Spring, the war against ISIS, and Syria, gaining a fascinating insight into the way policy is made at the top levels of American politics. Turning her attention to commentary, she is a regular guest on major networks including CNN and the BBC, and penned articles for esteemed publications including The Atlantic, The New Statesman, and, of course, New Lines magazine. Now based in London, she has set up her own company, Mindwork Strategies, a policy and strategic communications advisory firm which promotes empathy-based policies including positive mental health in the workplace. She remains a frequent commentator on the conflict in Gaza. And she joins us today to discuss her remarkable career and the unique insider's insight she has gained from the battlefields of Iraq to the halls of power in Washington. Jasmine El-Gamal, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're speaking just before the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and we're kind of in this interregnum where I think there's this kind of excitement about the Harris-Walz candidacy. And it hasn't yet given way to an understanding of what it actually might be like, what their candidacy might actually be like in terms of policies. I should ask first, do you think it was the right thing for Biden to step aside?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think he should have stepped aside months before.
Okay.
It was insane to me that he was still the candidate up until the time that he was. And it was even crazier to me that after that debate performance, people were still insisting that he must be the candidate. He's the only one that that could beat, Donald Trump. I remember thinking, I think I even wrote this on Twitter or on X. I remember just thinking about Kamala Harris and thinking, God, how many women know what it feels like to just be there and just be ready and be good for the job and right for the job, but be completely passed over, right? And just put in that number 2 position. Just stay there, be a good number 2, and this person who can barely speak or function anymore because of his age, he's going to be our number 1. I just couldn't get that out of my mind, how that must have made her feel.
Do you think that if there'd been like a longer timeline and there was a kind of a competition for who the Democratic contender would be, that she might have been passed over again?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, because I think look at her now. Look at her. I think it's not just the energy that people are responding to, but she's brilliant. She's articulate. She knows how to connect with audiences. We haven't seen many of her own ideas yet. So This is not me, being like, Kamala's my hero or anything like that. I think that, I think as human beings, and especially in our, sort of political culture, we tend to lionize people and just put them on a pedestal and just say, this is the perfect person. And they can only disappoint us from that point. So I'm very careful not to do that anymore.
Well, that was what I was wondering, because I mean, if you've spent so much time in the in the halls of power and around politics, you've met people who have been lionized, the Clintons and Obamas of the world, and people are very excited by them. And then inevitably they do something you don't like, invade Iraq, drone strike Yemen, something like that. And then you feel like, what, that all the hopes were wrong? Or you still lionize them, but you just say, well, it's the reality of politics now?
I think that what I've learned and what a lot of people learn when they work in government is you learn that they're just people. And, you know, whether it's the secretary, I mean, you might think the Secretary of Defense is this, you know, intimidating figure. He can, you know, wage a war from his plane.
Yeah.
I've been on that plane, by the way.
Right.
It's amazing.
Right.
But, or even the president. I mean, people put so many hopes in Obama when he was first elected, and people see what they want to see in these figures, right? We make them into our heroes because we think that they will do something for us, or they will speak for us, or represent us. And then at the end of the day, you realize they're actually just human beings. They have their own faults. They have their own weaknesses. They have their own insecurities. They have their own career, you know, traumas as well. I remember when I was at the Defense Department, I worked for 3 secretaries of defense.
Yeah.
My favorite was Chuck Hagel.
Right.
On a personal level.
Okay.
He was so nice.
Who were the other 2?
Robert Gates and Leon Panetta.
Okay. And Hegel was the last.
And Hegel was the last.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
And he was just he was so nice to me. I don't think he was nice to everybody, to be fair,
Right.
but he was very nice to me. I used to translate his phone calls with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's now the president of Egypt, but used to be the defense secretary at the time.
Yeah.
And afterwards, I would sit there and kind of clarify anything, and he would always listen and seek my opinion. But the funny thing about him, and what made me really relate to him as a human, is that we both liked to swim.
Okay.
And there was a pool in the Pentagon gym, and I would just run into him at the pool swimming laps. I would literally get out of the pool and just stare at the Secretary of Defense in his bathing suit. We're both having done laps, and I just was like, this is just a human. And then he ended up kind of being pushed out of the administration.
Yeah, because of ISIS, I think.
Because of some Middle East, but you know, it's so long ago now, I can't remember the details. But I do remember that there was a sense that he was kind of the fall guy, like scapegoated a little bit.
Okay.
And I just remember thinking, wow, it even happens to people at the top, you know, this stuff that goes on in your career, and you worry about your legacy, and you worry about, was I treated fairly, was I treated unfairly, all the stuff that people at my level would deal with all the time.
Yeah.
You saw your boss dealing with that, you know, the very, very top guy. And it just really humanized, I think, the whole experience for me. But that was very late at my time at the Pentagon. Before that, it was quite different. I did look up to people like they were, you know, infallible or somehow better, you know, because of the positions that they were in.
I mean, it's different, isn't it, with the secretaries of defense and other people who are appointed, because they're kind of appointed by, you know, the main dude, and it's the main dude, so far still a dude, that you see that does the rallies, that tries to sell themselves to the American public. So it's, to some degree, you can understand why people get a, you know, kind of a hagiographical idea of these individuals. Yeah. But when you're thinking about someone like Hegel or any of these other people, they're just people. They're just doing a job. But weirdly, I have a different thought process about it, because as much as you say, you know, they are just people and they're thinking about their own legacy and they have their own problems and their traumas and so on, they are doing things which have enormous repercussions in the world. I mean, as you were saying, if you're on the plane with Hegel and he can start a war,
of course,
that's a real war. Children dead, buildings destroyed, all of that stuff. That's real consequences for perhaps tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people for a generation, because you don't forget a war easily. Even a limited strike you wouldn't forget. And they're doing it all while you're on the plane with them, while they're thinking about their traumas, while they're worried about where they're going to send their kids to school. That kind of disconnect, don't you think? Did you ever think about that and just wonder about it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I worked for quite senior level people at the Pentagon, and I worked closely with them, and obviously without mentioning any details, I mean, I got to know their personal lives, and there were, you know, people whose kids, hated their job because they never got to see their parents.
Right.
There were people who were working through divorce arrangements and when they were going to see their kids and how to think about custody and they all, have to show up to work. There were people who lost parents. There were people who lost children.
But I'm saying about the flip side of that, which is that they are human. At the same time, they have the ability to wage real hard war.
Well, they have to.
Do they have to?
They have to. I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, we can talk about, because this is a very important point. You have to strike that balance when you're in that kind of leadership position between modeling what it means to be a human being with feelings and lives outside of work, and at the same time show up to fulfill your responsibilities and deal with the things you have to do. There are certain things that when you get to a high enough level, you don't get to be like just the average worker anymore. You know what I mean? I mean, you have a certain level of responsibility. For example, let me say something about President Biden.
Okay.
And how he's handled this war in Israel and between Israel and Gaza. President Biden is obviously, by his own admission, a huge supporter of Israel. He's hugely empathetic towards Israel, but he's also sympathetic towards Israel. He has a love for Israel. It's an emotional empathy. It's not just cognitive, where you just put yourself in the other person's shoes. It's actual, like, I feel what you're feeling.
Right.
Now, a normal human being has the luxury of feeling emotional towards a certain country or a certain people or, whatever. In a time of war, you sympathize with one side over the other. But President Biden is the president of the United States. He's the leader of the free world. You don't get to lead with your emotion, especially when your emotion is one-sided. It is incumbent upon you as someone in that level of responsibility or with that level of responsibility to put your emotion aside, right? Or at least combine it with your brain as well to say, okay, I feel for the Israelis. I have a history with the Israelis. I know, what they're going through. I can really, put myself there. But I'm also the president, and I have a job to do, which is make sure that this doesn't spiral into an all-out regional war. So I am going to also do the exercise of putting myself in the shoes of the Palestinians and think about what they want, why they do what they do, what the Arabs want, what the Qataris want, what the Saudis want. I mean, that is your job, right? And so do you see,
Yeah. And do you think he's done that?
No.
Oh.
I
This
don't.
is why
I don't.
You were very critical of the foreign policy over Gaza.
Extremely critical.
You wrote that its shallowness, complacency, and lack of foresight would catapult the region into the low-level state of conflict that it is in today.
Yes.
We're almost stepping into a much higher state of conflict.
Absolutely. And
still Biden's fault?
I, stand by everything I said because I knew where this was going. Not because I'm some, I don't have a magic 8-ball somewhere, but this is where we are now is a logical progression of the last few months of bad policies. We are, as a country, as the United States, President Biden has unequivocally supported the Netanyahu government, and I say that specifically. This is a Netanyahu government. He chose his extremist coalition members to stay in power. He knows, he's a reckless person. He is reviled in his own country by most of the population. And he's just unleashed a massive amount of conflict in the region, and he just gets a blank check.
But he gets a blank check from the person you're talking about, from Biden.
Well,
Biden has the ability to do things differently, and he hasn't.
He gets a blank check from, I don't want to single out Biden. Obviously the U.S. has the most leverage.
Right.
But, look at the Sunak government. Look
Right.
at Germany. Look at...
all of those things are true, but
it's
not in the same category.
It's not in the same category, but I'm just saying imagine a scenario where every single European country and the UK were united pressuring the US to put more pressure on Israel, and how different things might look.
Well, some people might recall that was almost a situation with the Iraq War, and it still ended up with the invasion of Iraq. So even were the European countries to be against the war in Gaza openly and publicly, would that make a difference to Biden? As you say, he seems to have a sympathetic attachment to one side.
It might have made a difference in some issues. I think critics of my argument, critics of, sort of people who are countering the critics' argument against Biden, say, this is naive, there's domestic politics to think about, he can't do this in an election year, all of that stuff. But people forget that this level of unconditional support is not usual. It's not something that is set in stone. It's not even something that was done and provided by prior U.S. presidents.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I mean, we know that. That's a fact.
Different U.S. presidents would have handled this situation differently.
With the same domestic situation, with the same, advocacy groups calling for certain things, have made different decisions. And I said this recently, because when we talk about Kamala Harris and where she might land, and you have people calling for her to do exactly what Biden did, to continue, and you have people on the other end calling for her to completely cut off, arms embargo, reevaluate the entire relationship. Well, there are a whole host of options between those two extremes.
2 points, right.
And when I criticize the Biden administration, I'm doing so from the perspective of someone who has worked in government, who knows what our options are, who knows what it means to have a president who actually, is not so completely one-sided in a conflict. President Biden, before the war in Gaza, before October 7th, rallied Europe to the defense of Ukraine. He was a unifier, an organizer, a convener, right? He has that in him. If he had wanted to, he could have done some things in that realm of possibilities that I'm talking about, between everything or nothing.
Right.
And specifically, I'm talking about real low-hanging fruit, like don't let people starve in Gaza.
Yeah.
Seems like a fairly low-hanging fruit to me, right? Very non-controversial.
Well, I think that's why it's interesting when you've seen it from the inside, because you understand that it isn't merely one switch or the other. You don't just say, okay, you're no longer our best ally in the Middle East, we're not going to talk to you anymore. That isn't how it works.
No.
There's a whole host of things, and some of them are even like formulaic.
Yeah.
Like the Americans decided not to look at what was happening with their weapons. Mm-hmm. They could decide to look at that.
It's literally U.S. law.
Right.
We are breaking our own law to continue to provide offensive weapons to units in Israel, in the IDF, who have used those U.S. weapons to violate international law. I mean, that should not be controversial. And I think if you had a president who was willing to make that case, I mean, he spent months bear hugging Israel in public.
Bear hugging
no
Netanyahu,
daylight.
not just Israel.
Yeah, but I'm just sorry.
Bear hugging Netanyahu,
right.
not just Israel.
But
that's
Netanyahu, we can't also forget the fact, and I think people on the sort of very some of the people who are very critical of Israel and Israeli policies, and Netanyahu, of course, rightly so. I feel that some people tend to gloss over, not mention or belittle the level of trauma that Israelis went through on October 7th. I mean, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. That is no small thing. That is a trauma. That is a national trauma. And I think people tend to, some people will say, well, but look at what's happening on the other side of the border. How can you talk about that as a trauma? You have your country, you have your passport, you have your safety, you have your bunkers. It's still a trauma in their minds. And that goes to something else that I've been talking about a lot, which is trauma is not a zero-sum game. You can have two separate traumas happening. You don't have to compare them, but you have to understand them. And the reason I bring that up is because that trauma during that time, it didn't matter who was Prime Minister of Israel. What mattered was President Biden, Anthony Blinken wanted to go to Israel and say, we're here for you. We understand what happened. This was a hugely shocking and traumatic incident. He did that for months, Biden. Now, the whole concept of a bear hug, ostensibly, is to do so that it gives you the space.
Right, it gives you the leverage to then...
To do,
Exactly.
to take some tough measures when you need to say tough words behind the scenes when you need to.
Yeah.
It's not a bear hug, an indefinite bear hug, just for the sake of bear hugging, right?
Yeah.
And so President Biden had already unequivocally demonstrated that he was a supporter of Israel, he was a friend of Israel, he was never going to allow anything to happen to the Israeli people. The defense was there, and it is there, and it has always been there. And so if anyone could have taken some firm steps to change the situation on the ground in Gaza, it would have been Biden, had he had the willpower and the desire to do so.
Do you think that the Harris-Walz combination might be different?
I think it's such an interesting duo and an interesting combination. First of all, Harris, and I know people will say these are just words, but getting the words right is a very important first step. And it's a first step, not the only step, but it's a first step. And when the way that she talks about the issue, the people that she met with members of the uncommitted movement in Michigan before her rally.
Who said, by the way, that they needed more than words?
Who said that they needed more than words. They asked her for a meeting. She said she's open to considering a meeting. Maybe because I'm a creature of Washington, and I understand the realities. I understand that she's a candidate, so she has to appeal to every constituency on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
Everyone from unconditional support to Israel to zero support for Israel. She has to somehow talk to all of them.
Right.
Right?
Right.
At the same time,
she has no power. She can't actually
she
do
has
things.
no power in her position as vice president.
Right.
Because Biden is single-minded. He, by all accounts from people, journalists in D.C. that I talk to, people that I know, doesn't listen.
Oh, really?
To criticism.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that was obvious in the whole process of him trying to step aside? Refusing to step aside.
Tell me.
Refusing to step aside until 30 minutes before he stepped aside.
Until Sunday, I will never forget that photo. Who was it? It was Wolf Blitzer.
Okay, I didn't see the photo.
Just before the announcement, he posted a photo of himself on Twitter, like having some
I saw
drink.
that. Right, yeah.
And then
2
2 minutes later,
he's in the studio.
He's at the studio with this
live TV
look on his face, like, damn you. There were so many different, Kamala Harris's husband
all right. I didn't see that.
was at the gym. And he comes out of the gym and he has all these missed calls from everyone. Call your wife, So up until that moment, Biden wasn't listening. And not only was he not listening, he has surrounded himself by people who don't listen, who tell him what he wants to hear. And that's not a great trait for a leader. Now, we don't know much about Kamala Harris.
I mean, Biden very clearly pushed her to the side so that she
Yeah.
wouldn't be the candidate. I don't think that's a difficult political calculation to work out.
Well, not everyone treats their vice president like that.
True.
I mean, President Obama, there was a real partnership between, in fact, a lot of people credit Obama's choice to pick Biden as vice president and Biden's, he really flourished as vice president and he really raised his profile, which then enabled him to have a successful run for president. So not every president wants their vice president to just sit in a corner and stay quiet. So when I look at Kamala Harris as vice president, even just up until a few months ago, and I look at her now, I mean, she almost looks like a different person. She's someone who I feel she knows she's in the right place at the right time. She knows that she is the right person for the moment. She's meeting that moment. So, okay, I mean, let's talk about the vote, especially for Arab Americans right now. I mean, people are torn.
Yeah.
You have people who want to give her a chance if she just says a little bit more. You have people who are absolutely not going to vote for her. You have people who are going to vote for her, cross their fingers and hope for the best.
Right.
To prevent a Trump presidency. So there's this wide range of views. And when you talk about wishful thinking, I mean, when we go in and vote, we vote on a track record. We also vote on promises. And we vote on a little bit of faith.
Yeah.
It's a mixture of all. But I would say that Washington, D.C. is a tough beast. It can swallow you whole. You can be the most well-meaning politician, and you can go to Washington, and then you will realize how difficult it is to actually uphold your principles. There's just too much going on. There are too many lobbies. There are too many special interests. There's too much pressure. And, when someone, I don't know that I can point to one person, one politician that's gone into office and said, I'm happy to be a one-term whatever.
Yeah.
So I'll just do whatever I think is right.
Yeah.
You go in and you play the game.
It's hard to give up that power. I don't blame Biden for that
Once
reason.
you get into power,
Yeah.
whether you're a junior congressman or the president, you don't want to, and not just because, there are some people who don't want to leave because they're power hungry. There are some people who don't want to leave because, and I do believe Biden had a little of this, where you believe in your heart that you are the only person who can fix this, who can do this, who can, you know what I mean? And you start to convince yourself that you are obligated. I don't have, obviously I was never a high-level politician, but when I was at Guantanamo Bay as a translator, I was 24 years old. And I was going to go there for 6 months to see what I can do in terms of, translating on these tribunals and stuff.
Yeah.
I ended up staying for a year and a half because I felt that only I could really, translate the intricacies and build bridges and make sure that everyone understands and humanizes. And, I had a responsibility to be there. I make things better. I have to be there. I
You
mean,
really felt all those things.
Why else would I stay in Guantanamo for a year and a half?
Yeah.
I mean, I felt this huge responsibility and this huge pull and this huge desire to make things better. And that was me at 24. So,
Imagine you at 81.
Imagine you at 81 with this long career, with this track record, When he said, I've done this before, I can do it again, I believe that he believed that.
I believe he believed it, yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it was an ego thing a little bit, but I do believe that he believed that he needed to follow through and to get, to finish what he started, and have a second term to really solidify, things. But this is where the advisors come in, and this is where the inner circle comes in, and this is where why it's so important to surround yourself with people who can just hold up a mirror and say,
time to step aside.
You've done amazing things for this country.
Politics is a rough beast.
So politics is tough, and DC is tough. It's not an easy place to function.
You brought up Gitmo. You said in a piece for us that it was one of the strangest places you'd ever been. Yeah. I mean, must be something like an understatement. Describe it for us a little bit, what it was like.
It was surreal. It was surreal in so many ways because, it was a naval base. It had been used for other things before. There were people living there with their families. By the time I had gotten there, it was like a little town. There were restaurants, tennis courts. People were living there with their families. There was a tiki bar, where people would go and hang out in the evening. People took boat lessons and scuba diving lessons. People worked and lived there as if it was any normal U.S. base anywhere in the world.
And yet?
But then you had this whole other world, behind the barbed wire, where, the most horrendous things we came to learn later had happened, in that beginning time, where I think the worst of America, materialized. You had people who were basically rounded up in Afghanistan for the most ridiculous of reasons sometimes, the flimsiest of reasons, just boarded up, sent to Gitmo, and then they just stayed there. No one told them where they were or why they were there. Nobody told their families. It was this black hole. And it was, when you're, it was just, at the time, it was so surreal. It was just like, how does this happen? who's in charge here? How do we do this? How do we make the case for this? How does this exist? And it was, by the time I showed up, I didn't see, obviously, like the worst of the things that had happened, the tortures and the waterboarding.
You didn't know about those things before you got there?
Did I? No, I mean, I'm trying to think of when the stories came out in the media. I remember very clearly when I decided to go to Gitmo is because I was reading an article. I had come back from Iraq. I had been in Iraq, and I had learned a whole bunch of lessons there. And I was reading an article where Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, said, these are the worst of the worst. And I just knew that, we had been lied to by that administration about why we went to Iraq, about what was in Iraq, about, all different kinds of things. And I just knew that we shouldn't be taking things at face value that administration was saying. At the time, I was due to go back out to be a translator somewhere else. I had wanted to go back to Iraq for a second time.
Right.
General Petraeus, who was then Colonel Petraeus, his translator was leaving, and we were friends, so he said, why don't you come and replace me? So that's what I had wanted to do.
Okay.
But by then, it was super dangerous in Iraq. All the suicide bombings had started. My boss didn't want to send me, so he said, you can go anywhere else. And then I happened to read that article about Gitmo, and I said, well, I want to go to Gitmo.
I mean, if you could go anywhere else, and you obviously have the support of the people above you, and you're an ambitious young woman at the time, isn't it strange that the one place that you would choose is probably the worst place you could have gone?
Not really. I mean, not really if you know who I am and what I'm interested in. I mean, I studied psychology in school. I've always been really interested in humans and why they do what they do. I studied the Holocaust in college. I've always been really, really fascinated with what makes people do bad things, because I don't believe that we are born with the capacity to hate or to be racist or to torture or to do any of those things. Everyone's born with a clean slate. So how do we get there? I've always been fascinated with that. And then after my experience in Iraq, where I realized that I could be a bridge between the U.S. and Arab-speaking peoples, whether it was in Iraq or anywhere else,
yeah.
I felt like I had to be there. I didn't go there in a sort of voyeuristic, I want to see what this is. I was like, I want to go see what I can do. That was just my instinct.
And what do you feel now about it? I mean, do you think you did make a difference? Do you think it left you with certain scars? It's an extraordinary place to witness, this kind of black hole.
It was a life-changing experience. I can tell you without exaggeration and without being dramatic that it changed. I stopped being able to sleep through the night after that. I used to be a good sleeper. I haven't been since then, which, seems like fairly benign compared to what people went through over there who were actually imprisoned, unjustly imprisoned, because so many were. But in terms of, it was very tough, but I was glad that I did it. I think it was the right thing to do. I struggled with it for a very long time. I struggled with it while I was there, not because I was involved in anything that I was translating for these tribunals, for these administrative review boards. So I was, if anything, I was really making sure that the communication between the arbitrators, on the U.S. side, the judges and the detainees was clear, that their stories were communicated, that every question was asked. So in that small kind of like, if this was my job and that was my mission, I felt like I did it well. So before I came here, I was actually looking through my notes and my journal entries from that time, and I found this letter that I wanted to share with you. I actually don't know who wrote it because they left it underneath my door, and the envelope just says Jazz.
It's just an envelope, and it just has Jazz scrawled on it.
Yeah. But I when I read it, it really made an impact on me, and I think helps explain my subsequent career choices. So I'm just going to read a little part of it for you. So a lot of these officers were like reservists who had never really been in this kind of situation before. So some of them were very overwhelmed with what they were doing, supposed to do. So he says, the other night, I was so appreciative of your encouraging words of support, for it seems that so few share in doing just that. Sometimes a few choice and inspiring words at the right time make a huge difference to others. Like you, so he said, if you hadn't said that, I would simply turn to finding victory with tallying up in absentia tribunals. This detainee didn't want to participate. We convinced him to. He told his story, and I think it ended up well for him. So he said, instead of striving to give others their opportunity to be able to tell their story to someone who's willing to listen, like you, I believe that these individuals are humans themselves and that they are all deserving of others who are willing to listen and willing to help convey their reasons why they are not combatants. You're right. If just one of the many should be set free, our job has been done for humanity. So I wish I knew who wrote that to me, because this changed. I mean, I read this and I said, that's it. This is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. This is what I'm doing, is just, if there is an opportunity to reveal the humanity of the people that we are working with and for and against even, and to see them as human beings, right? When we're making policy that will affect them, when we are talking to them as detainees, when we're talking to them as people across the aisle, or whatever you want to call it. I felt like that's what everything suddenly fell into place and made sense. And it went from being a translator to being, someone who just wanted to humanize people, to make better policies, and to just help us operate on the basis of respect and common humanity.
You did leave, though. You wrote in the essay that by the time I left Gitmo 2 years later, I had come to see its very existence as a devastating blow to America's moral standing in the world. What happened that took you to that conclusion?
Well, first, I mean, that's the impression that's the sort of impression that I had going in, that this was, the whole thing was, I don't want, the technical legal terms. I don't know. I mean, I know that the president at the time, his lawyers, found a lot of loopholes and ways in which this was, not entirely illegal, but, taking people from their homes off the streets and sending them to Gitmo with no due process for 2 years. I had an idea of what it was before I went, but by the time I left, I had just seen, people languishing, people who I thought were never going to get out. I had seen the full impact and the full picture of what the policy choices that we had made as a country, and how they affected so many people's lives, their families, the region, how our moral standing in the world. I mean, all of that stuff. I just walked out of there and I just said, I felt to myself, am I ever going to be able to make sense of any of this? But also, are we ever going to learn the lessons that we need to learn from this? Like, is this going to end up being something that changes us as a country for the better?
I think that's still an unknown question.
And I think that's still an unknown.
The other big conflict which changed the lives of lots of people that you were involved in was the war in Iraq. And you went there. That was the first role that you had overseas as a translator. And you went after the war had begun, but 2003, I mean, in the early days.
First days, yeah.
First days.
Yeah.
What was that like? You were there as an interpreter and a cultural advisor.
Also, yeah.
What was that like, I mean, going in?
I mean, that was a shit show.
Okay.
From the beginning. Okay. It was a microcosm of everything wrong with the war. No planning, no idea of what we were doing, no preparation, no context, no understanding, no exit plan. I mean, I was 20 years old, right? I was just thrown in, like, just thrown in with no idea of what to expect, what to do. You know, I spoke Egyptian, colloquial Egyptian. I had never heard an Iraqi dialect before.
Wow.
I went to Iraq.
Wow.
Right? Because initially they were like, well, we're going to send you to Kuwait. Then I go to Kuwait, and then 5 minutes after I arrived, they're like, actually, we're just going to send you off to Iraq. And I was like, okay, I'm down.
Yeah.
I'm down. I obviously have no idea what it's like to be in a war. Everything's just so weird, so surreal.
You don't think even that seems like a microcosm of the chaos of Iraq?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
America is a big country. They have people who speak Iraqi dialect. They didn't need someone who speaks Egyptian dialect. Did they even know the difference? Did they care?
Exactly, right? I mean, it's all Arabic. It's all whatever,
Yeah.
you know? When we as interpreters, or at least when I mean, remember, I was the first wave.
Right.
I would hope that they changed their procedures after that. But when I took the test so that they could figure out whether I was qualified, I had to translate a paragraph from a newspaper from English to Arabic, written.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
That was the test.
But in fact, most of your translation, when you got there, the interpreting was, I mean, you were speaking to people.
Right. And so for the first, I mean, it was a crash course in Iraqi dialect.
And you were speaking to people, sorry to interrupt you, but you were speaking to people at their worst. They're frightened, they're scared, they're hurt. And it's one thing, I mean, the Iraqi dialect is a wonderful dialect, but I mean, it does have words in it that don't exist in other Arabic dialects.
100%. And the accent, and it's very guttural, and it's very, you know. So I go there. I'll give you two quick anecdotes. The first just is I was working with a civil affairs unit in southern Iraq. So we were meant to go in and, you know, after sort of the, you know, quote unquote bad guys had been taken out, we would go in after that and start assessing for reconstruction purposes. So like what hospitals need to be rebuilt, taking stock of what people need, talking to people in town, you know, stuff like that. So we're in a meeting, this is like my first week or something, and we're talking to this old guy. And they're asking me to explain something to him. So a blessing for me was that everyone understands Egyptian. So I was speaking in Egyptian.
Okay.
Or like a mix of Egyptian and modern standard. And so I was telling this guy, I was translating what the officers were telling me to translate. And then I would say, I said, do you understand? And then the guy says, eh. So eh in Iraqi means yes. In Egyptian, it means what? So he said, eh. I thought he said what? So I repeated myself. And I was like, do you get it now? And he's like, eh. And I was like, God, what is this guy not understanding? And so the third time, finally, he was like, I understand.
Did he say it in English? He just had enough.
He said enough. I'm like, I understand. So slowly, I learned very quickly, obviously. But I still had no concept what it was like to be in a war, to go to these, you know, at the time, this was before the fall of Saddam. This was early days. This was March 2003. So there was one instance where the unit I was with, we were kind of like settling in for the night. We would just like park in the desert somewhere and sleep on the Humvees and the hoods and, you know, wherever we could sleep in sleeping bags. And it was freezing at night. And somehow the nearest village had gotten word that there were Americans at this particular place. And someone told us that some people were coming. And so we prepared for like 20, 30 people, I mean, if I remember correctly. And we had some meals ready to eat, MREs and some water. We set everything up nicely. Hundreds of people showed up. This is like after midnight. It's freezing. There are insects flying in the air, like the size of my hand. Like, it's insane. And I'm the only person who speaks Arabic on the U.S. side. I was terrified. The Iraqis were scared. They were hungry. They didn't know what was happening to them. There were bombs, you know, they were watching the news. And the Americans were freaking out. They were like, what are we going to do? So the Iraq, you know, and this is why I'm talking about this is my biggest lesson from Iraq, right? If I talk about my life lessons, was the importance of listening, right? So these people are kind of, they're hungry, they want food, this and that and the other, and the Americans are, their instinct is to just push them away as if they're dealing with like a rioting, a crowd of rioters or something. They don't understand what they want. It was very aggressive, and I'm just racking my brain, like trying to figure out what to do. And so finally, I stand up. I kid you not. I don't know how I did this, but I stood up I've obviously, for people who are not watching, I'm not a very tall person. So I stand up and I just scream into this crowd of men. I'm like, listen up, this is extremely important. Does anyone have a cigarette I can borrow?
What?
And everyone started laughing. All these guys who were just yelling a few minutes before, they were like, what? And they just started laughing. Someone like produces a cigarette. I just sit down and I'm like, let's have a smoke. Let's talk. We have food over here. Everyone's gonna get food. Don't worry. Let's have a cigarette. And we just sat and had a cigarette and just talked, and everyone calmed down. Then they got their food. Then I went to the women's side. We had separated them, sat with the women, listened to their stories, tried to understand what I could. And it was just that. It was just like the act of listening. It didn't change anything in the big picture. It didn't make their lives better. It didn't make this war go away. But that's the principle that I took to my work at the Pentagon. That's the principle that I try to embody in my writing, when I'm writing and when I'm talking, when I'm doing media, when I'm advising. The first thing is, have you listened? Have you just listened?
What do you think it felt like for them? Because they had just seen their country bombed, the leadership was on the run, and there were lots of people with heavy weaponry wandering around their country. How do you think, when you, not just those group of Iraqis that we're talking about, but I mean just generally when you were interacting with Iraqis, I mean, did you ever think about it from their perspective? Like what it must feel like?
People were scared. People thought, women would run away when they saw a U.S. soldier walking towards them because they thought that their Oakley sunglasses were, that you could see through people's clothes with those sunglasses because they were mirrored and sometimes colored. Those Oakley, and they were, people,
that wasn't the only reason why people ran away from American soldiers.
No,
it wasn't
but I'm
just
saying,
because they thought.
I was working with the civil affairs unit, so we would walk around. I would walk around ahead of the soldiers. Obviously, I was not armed. They had their weapons very concealed. I'm saying one of the reasons,
yeah.
But in the South, where I was fairly calm, and we had my mission, our unit's mission was to figure out what people needed and send those requirements up the chain so that they could get what they needed. So I had a fairly different experience from other translators who were up north or in Baghdad
very
or,
different,
very, very different.
And you were in a predominantly Shia area.
Exactly, and that's why, in the town where I was, do you remember Donald Rumsfeld saying they're going to greet us with, or whoever it was that was saying they're going to greet us with?
I think a lot of people remember that.
With flowers and candies and stuff. That was the case where I was. I didn't understand why at the time. It was my first introduction to Iraq, but it was a very different context from other areas in Iraq. I'm just telling you, the Oakley. It was not meant to be dismissive as like that was the only reason why people were scared of American soldiers. Obviously, there were other reasons, and there were other times when we were in firefights. We were caught in firefights. That was another thing that I didn't know what it looked like. I mean, there was one time when we were just sitting. I was reading a magazine. We were in between areas, and I saw a red light flash right in front of me, and I literally just went back to reading my magazine because I didn't know what it was. And then it happened again, and then I saw another one here, and then eventually I looked to the sergeant. I was like, "Hey Henry, what is that red stuff?" And he just looked at me and he was like, get
All
down,
hell broke loose,
get
yeah.
down. We were in a firefight. I didn't even know what that was. That's the level of preparation, of naivete, of just like being thrown into this place. But again, that's a microcosm of the US experience in Iraq. We had no idea what we were doing, no idea what we were getting into, no, respect. We didn't even have the level of respect to like sit and actually not only learn these things, but teach them to people who were actually going to be going in there on the ground.
Right.
And then I look at, when I went into the Pentagon, my idea was, I've been to Iraq, I've been to Gitmo, I'm going to like bring in this perspective that is not prevalent in the Pentagon, and Middle East policy will change for the better.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes.
This is a theme.
Like,
I mean, it does seem to be a
the
theme.
theme of just like, I want to make things better.
You go to Iraq, you hope it'll change. You go to Gitmo, you hope it'll change. You go to the Pentagon, you hope it'll change. Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you?
How is that working out for you? I mean, you do what you can, and I think that I obviously, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and I would rather do that than not do anything. I mean, obviously, when I was at the Pentagon, we had the Arab Spring, ISIS, Syria, all of that stuff. I led the Syria team during the Syria conflict. You can obviously see that not many people had much sway, in terms of what we did in Syria. My big lesson at the Pentagon was I learned a lot. I learned how U.S. policy works. I met some nice people. I met some great public servants, some of whom are in the administration today and are trying to do what they can from the inside, by the way. Because that's, sometimes you just do make the choice to try to make a bad situation better.
Yeah.
But my biggest lesson was I don't want to work in government anymore.
I want to ask you the hard question that I know people have asked you about Iraq, which is, do you think that you were serving the occupation?
That is a very good question, and I can definitely see why people would say that and think that. I remember my friends in Egypt, the ones I had grown up with, gave me a really hard time about it. And I remember saying, but I'm helping people, we're reconstructing. And then my friend goes, you're reconstructing what you destroyed. Yeah. Right?
Hard to disagree.
I was so upset because I was like, I'm not, I'm not them. I'm trying to do, I was young. You have to remember, I was 20 years old when I went to Iraq.
How do you feel about it now, about that idea that you're not them? Because, you hold the same citizenship, you were protected by the same...
I don't mean I'm not them, I'm not the Americans. I'm very, I'm an American. I'm an Egyptian American, and I'm proud of that. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I will always hold that ideal of America in my head, that it could be a better place and be a force for good. That has always partly, that's why I'm so hard on them. That's why I'm so hard on the U.S. administration, right? It's because I know that we could do better. We have the capacity to do better. We just need the willpower to do better. When I said I'm not them, I just said I'm not one of those neocon, people who want, who hates the Middle East. I'm not an occupier. I'm not, I was still, I think at the time I didn't really understand a lot of what those things meant in the larger sense. And it took me, I think we'll get into the mental health, a part of the conversation at some point. I want to tell you that it wasn't until COVID, so that was 17 years after I was in Iraq, that everything that I had witnessed, been a part of, all these questions, all these criticisms, all these doubts, was it the right thing to do? Was I part of the problem? That came crashing down, because it was the first time in 17 years that I was still, that the world was quiet, and that I had time to process everything that I had been through, and that others had gone through, that I had been witness to.
I think actually about the Iraq War, where have you landed on interventionism? Because that there's this strain of American philosophy, political philosophy, which is about isolationism, and you should worry about what's happening within the borders and not worry about foreign wars. Where have you landed in 17 years since Iraq?
Good question. I mean, I believe in the responsibility to protect.
Really?
I mean, that's a very, I think, I believe in collective responsibility. And
That's an incredibly unpopular view now. You realize that, don't you?
is it?
Responsibility to protect. Yeah.
Why?
Iraq killed it.
We weren't protecting anyone in Iraq.
Wasn't that the argument for why they went in?
No. It was to get weapons of mass destruction. There was nothing about protecting anybody. Even in Afghanistan, it wasn't responsibility to protect. We'd have to look back. I mean, was Libya, was Libya responsibility to protect? I don't remember Libya now, but no, I mean, I don't consider Iraq at all to be part of that.
Okay.
That was, a very neocon kind of, it was a lie. It was just an outright lie. It was about so many things, nothing to do with R2P. But I believe in the responsibility. I believe in the responsibility to protect. I'm not saying that we should go in and intervene every time we need to protect, but
right.
I do believe in the responsibility to protect.
Okay.
I do believe that, our world is so intertwined, and so many of the problems, the challenges that we see in the Middle East, that we see, across the world, no matter where you are, that didn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Name a dictator, and I'll tell you, we can list, how many countries in the West support them, arm them, finance them. And so when it comes time for that dictator to decide that they want to decimate their entire population, like we saw in Syria,
yeah.
then I do believe we have a responsibility to protect. It doesn't have to mean an invasion. I also think that every U.S. president is going to put U.S. lives first and the lives of U.S. troops first. That's their job as U.S. president. But I don't believe that any one country lives on an island, cut off from anyone or anything. I talk about this a lot when I talk about the refugee and migrant issues, that we're facing now today here in the UK, that we saw in Europe after the Syria war. These refugees weren't just created out of thin air. So I do believe in especially the West, particularly the West, and within the West, particularly the United States. I believe in our moral responsibility, if not to proactively do good, then to do no harm, at the very least.
Perhaps that brings us up to the modern world and Gaza. Do you think that those ideas are now at play in what we're seeing in the Gaza war? The responsibility to protect, the idea of doing no harm.
Yes, and we're failing miserably. It is a travesty what we're looking at and seeing on our screens every day. I mean, I don't think that what we've been, forget about what people in Gaza are going through, right? Not forget about it, just put that to the side. They are being erased. They're being erased. They're being killed. Collateral damage, whether you want to say it's targeted or not targeted, the result is the same. They're dying, right?
Okay.
That's a whole separate category, what they're going through. But what people outside of Gaza have been witnessing day in and day out, whether they're Palestinian, whether they have ties to Gaza, whether they're just Arab or not, and day after day after day, looking at videos of, you know what I don't have to say.
Of course, yeah, and the audience does as well.
And the audience does as well.
How do you
That's
think...
not normal. That's not normal. That is not something to be normalized. Even after 10 months, you scroll and you're almost taking it for granted now that at some point you're just going to see body parts, on your screen. That is not normal. And people, people are traumatized by what they're seeing. And they're traumatized not only because of it's, you know, the vicarious trauma that they feel because of the actual trauma that the Palestinians in Gaza are going through.
Yeah.
Israelis are traumatized, obviously, because of what they saw on October 7th and those videos.
Yeah. Still hostages.
Still, the hostage families are, I mean, yesterday I was listening to the news, Hamas saying that they've killed a hostage, and immediately my mind just went to the hostage families and what they must be feeling, thinking, is it mine? Is it, you know?
And they've been waiting 8 months for news, and
it's crazy,
this
right?
is the news they get after 8 months.
And so I think that you know, there's such a collective trauma. There are layers of trauma. There's moral injury. There's this feeling of helplessness. This feeling that does anybody believe in right or wrong anymore? Is anyone actually doing what's just and right and humane? And when the answer is no, time and time again, from leadership, from world leaders, you start to think like you're going crazy, like you're living in a world that is just not the real world.
You work on these topics now because, of course, you have it's a strategic consultancy, MindWorks. And well, you work on it in two ways because, of course, you're very prominent now talking about the war in Gaza. But then equally, you have this kind of professional aspect where you're involved in policy of it. Not policy of Gaza, but policy more generally. How does it feel for you? I can imagine at the beginning of the war, maybe because you didn't know how long it would last, you're talking about it, analyzing it, understanding it, but it's just gone on and on and on. It must take quite a toll on you, just constantly being involved, constantly making the argument, and perhaps feeling that the argument is going into the ether and nothing's changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, there's so much trauma everywhere, and I think on a spectrum, I would say that I'm in a fairly obviously privileged position. I work for myself. I don't have to worry about being fired for what I say about the war. I'm self-funded. I can say whatever I want, whenever I want. I make my own money. I choose my own clients. That's a very, very, very privileged position, and I'm very, aware of that and grateful for that. But it is precisely because of that that I feel, again, here's the theme, this sense of responsibility to say what other people can't say. I get so many messages from people who are like, thank you, I can't say this because of my job. People in tech companies have been particularly bad about this issue, people in think tanks, people in Washington, D.C., where they have to worry about their next job and whether they ever want to run for Congress or, whatever. And so it takes a toll in the same way that it takes a toll on anyone.
Right.
The pictures, the videos. I know what's going on, and I'm doing my part to talk about it, so I don't feel like I can't. I don't watch what I don't need to watch, and I don't see what, so on my Instagram, because I started getting all these new followers on Instagram at some point, and people will just, my DMs are open because I always want my friends tell me I should shut them off, but I always want people to be able to reach out. So, but people will just abuse that, and they will just send you with no warning, just like the most horrendous video, as if, like, why are you sending me this? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you're constantly bombarded with all these images. And obviously I am a huge proponent of therapy. I have seen a therapist every week, rain or shine, for the last 3 years. It's almost necessary at this point if you can afford it and have access to it. But I try to do, I think I've sort of nailed down what helps and what doesn't. And when things start to get really overwhelming, it's almost just like a checklist. I know that if I do as much of this checklist as possible, I'll be okay. And the less I do of it, the less okay I'll be, the less able I'll be to do my work. And I never really want to get to that position.
Well, you've been very open about your, let's say, your emotional journey. Even during this war, I was particularly struck by how you wrote about how grieving for your own father, who passed away very suddenly, and the grief that you felt watching the war in Gaza. How did you experience those two things?
I mean, grief is so multi-layered, as an emotion. And I think that when you have suffered a loss in your life, you're that much more susceptible to feeling other people's grief, to knowing what they're going through, to understanding, the process that they're going through. And then it's triggering when you're watching, mass loss on a mass scale.
Yeah.
It sort of triggers your own feelings of grief and loss and not being able to control things. And it was almost like I was just reimagining my experience and, using that experience to imagine what these people were going through, no matter who it was, just anyone who's lost a parent, a child, a loved one. Having to do that again and again and again and again on a daily basis. I don't just feel devastated for people. I worry about them because I know from my experience with grief that you don't actually process it until you're in a safe space and you have quiet time to process.
Do you think that this war, because it's played out on social media, it's been maybe particularly traumatic for other people to watch? I don't mean people who've been involved in it, people who are worried about the hostages and people worried about people in Gaza and all of those. I don't mean that. I mean just those people who aren't directly involved but are kind of following it. Because there's so much imagery, so much video, so much noise coming at you, it can be particularly traumatic, I think.
Of course. And I know that because people tell me that. I mean, people will, I think, for better or for worse, because there aren't many people talking about mental health I would say there aren't many people who are able to really speak openly about mental health and especially their own experiences in our fields, whether it's journalism, humanitarian response, all of that stuff. So people just will write to me and say, like, this, I'm experiencing so and so, and this and that. And it's all these things that I talked about before that people are feeling: vicarious trauma, moral injury, which is when you feel like you are witnessing something that is morally unjust and you are either complicit in it or you can't stop it. And I reached out to one psychiatrist who actually pioneered the studies on moral injury in journalists in conflict zones.
Right.
And, we talked a lot about, he helped me understand it a bit more, and I've tried to pass it on to people, is that moral injury is very similar to PTSD. And so you will experience the same symptoms: loss of excitement, guilt for just existing, let alone for the privileges that you have. You can't enjoy anything anymore. You're anxious. You can burst into tears, nightmares, lack of sleep. I mean, all of that stuff. So all of those things are things that people are experiencing because of what they're watching on social media and imagining what the people on the other end of that screen are actually going through. And I think that, this is a slightly tangential but related topic. I don't, workplaces, I don't think have, for the most part, caught up to the needs that their employees have when it comes to support, especially when they're doing something like journalism or investigative journalism, where you have to just watch video upon video upon video of bombs, and you have to look at the collateral damage and, all of that stuff. Or humanitarian workers, people who go on missions, people whose job it is to compile reports. It's much better than it used to be. Just in the last few years, there have been huge acknowledgments in those fields that we need to pay attention to mental health in the workplace, but there's still obviously a long way to go.
How do you feel now about the idea of changing things, about possibly trying to make a difference in the world?
I think I'm much more, I don't want to say jaded, because I don't, I still always believe in the potential, right? The potential. And if you don't believe in the potential for things to get better, you might just become complacent and say, screw it, I'm just going to go live my life and, nothing's going to change anyway. But people can make a difference in a million different ways in their lives. I have 2 sisters-in-law, they are raising the most incredible human beings, and that's making a difference, right? I'm not saying everyone needs to go out there and try to change policy, but it's my contribution, so I'll just keep doing it.
Jasmine El-Gamal, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. You can find Jasmine El-Gamal on Twitter at Jasmine El-Gamal. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson, Mindy Roscoe, and Mikey Andresen, and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app, or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.